The Lethal Gaming Gear Planet pads delivered 3 pads that completely exceeded all of my expectations, and 1 pad that was unfortunately a huge disappointment. The Planet range of pads are Lethal Gaming Gear's first entry into the mousepad space and been making waves for their price, quality and attention to detail, so let's see if they live up to the hype. All 4 pads come in the same 4mm thickness and are available in XL, XXL and XXX sizes, which Lethal assures me doesn't come with any sussy anime waifu decals on it, despite the name. The pads are also at a reasonable price for domestic US customers who can avoid expensive international shipping, with the XL pad starting at just $30. The first thing that really elevated these pads for me was the unboxing experience. Lewis Wallen and Ali Sun have done a tremendous job in creating a minimalist but distinctive range for the brand. Whilst the logo design does look great, it is unfortunately just glued onto the pad, and the logo on my Jupiter pad has already started peeling where my wrist contacts it. Let's hope we can see the logos printed directly onto the pad in the future to help resolve this. I'm also a little bit jaded from seeing so many black squares in the mousepad space at the moment, so maybe having a colour that accents or complements each Planet name to separate it could have been a good touch here. Now, despite the boxes being very attractive, they do ship the pads rolled, so unfortunately none of mine ever laid completely flat on the table, but this didn't impact my performance in any way. The stitching is below the pad, generally of high quality, and was consistent on all 4 of the pads that I received. Lethal do have a disclaimer about potential fraying on their edge stitching, and I was curious to know what that meant. I reached out for comment and they said that we have experienced less than 1% total queries regarding premature fraying, and every customer has been offered a replacement pad. So take from that what you will. In terms of bases, they're all using the same pattern rubber and I have 0 complaints. It stuck down to the desk and didn't move even under forceful pressure. All the pads have some level of water repellency, and I didn't notice any change in their glide whatsoever in a 30 to 50 degree humidity room during my testing. The 4 Planet pads offer a range of traditional cloth to hybrid surfaces to cater from the slowest control player up to the highest speed user. So what do I think of the Jupiter, Saturn, Venus and Mercury, and what other pads do they stack up against? Starting with the fastest pad of the range, the Mercury, we see a hybrid surface, and these have been gaining popularity quite a bit over the past year and are sometimes referred to as Hien clones. Hybrid surfaces excel for games that need quick reactions, smooth tracking and target adjustments, popular in games like Fortnite and Apex specifically. Stacking the Mercury against the flagship hybrid, the Artisan Hien, shows just how similar the two are. Even under scrutiny, the 2 weaves seem almost identical, but the Hien uses lower edge stitching, lays flatter to the desk, has a higher quality overall build, is available in 3 firmness options, has the same XY glide differences, and is fractionally larger than the Mercury. So the Hien's the clear winner, right? Game over? Well, not entirely. The Hien is a notoriously abrasive pad, and the Mercury is a lot more pleasant and softer to use over a longer period without a sleeve. It's also significantly slower than the Hien Mid and Soft, and is even noticeably slower than the Hien Extra Soft. This helped with overall stability for me and stopping power on flicks without interfering with the freedom of tracking and micro adjustment that I needed. Also, for those of you who find yourself in the good old US of A, as I mentioned, it's a $30 pad versus the Artisan $55 to $60, and is available immediately, so you don't have to wait for drops. The Mercury really sets the tone for my overall sentiment on the Lethal Gaming Gear Planet range. Is it Artisan quality? Not quite. Is it Artisan price? Not even close. The Mercury is a good pad, there's no doubt, but I think the Venus is something great. Whilst it's also billed as a hybrid speed pad, it takes a huge step down in speed from the Mercury and is a much more controllable, rougher surface. Even though it shares the same glide speed as faster control pads like the Zowie GSR-SE or the Vaxi PA, it's a rougher surface with more tactility, so I found it to be much more controllable in motion, and I had a better idea of where my cursor was at any moment. In fact, the Venus most closely reminded me of another Artisan mousepad, the Hayate Otsu V2. Outside of build and appearance, the surface feel between the two was almost indistinguishable. If you sat me down for a Pepsi challenge between the two, I'd honestly say it'd be quite difficult to tell them apart aside from some very subtle differences. The Venus has a bit more static friction than the Otsu, which meant it was harder to keep the mouse moving once you'd started, but conversely it made it easier to stop the mouse when you needed to land that precision flick, so I guess take that as a positive or a negative depending on your own preferences. I feel like in each of the individual comparisons with their Artisan counterpart, the Lethal Planet pad is just a touch slower, So if you've got on with pads like the Artisan Hien or the Artisan Hayate Otsu, but wanted something a little bit more controlled, then the Lethal Gaming Gear Planet pads might be a worthwhile consideration for you. Despite the Venus being slower, I think it's still completely viable in fast-paced action games like Apex, but at the same time it starts to have applicability for tac shooters. For me, the Venus is the perfect middle ground between control and speed. If I could only keep one of the pads from the Lethal Gaming Gear Planet range, it probably would have been the Venus because of how wide a game variety it works across and where it can be used in. That was until I tried the Saturn. The Lethal Gaming Gear Saturn has been dubbed by some as the Artisan Zero Killer, and you can kind of see where they're coming from with it. It's the first real attempt to recreate the Artisan Zero weave without some of the muddy feel that's often associated with slower control pads like you can see in the Zowie GSR or the X-Ray pad Equate. Moving down to the Saturn from the Venus felt like another noticeable step down in speed, and this time transitioning from a hybrid surface to a more traditional control pad. The Saturn is a smooth weave with heaps of dynamic and static friction, which gave me a real sense of control and steadied up my shaky boomer aim. I was easily the most comfortable and confident in game with the Saturn pad, but that could be because it's the closest to the typical control pads that I usually use. Now, if you're a hybrid pad simp or a competitive aimer, you might find that the Saturn is a bit too slow with too much friction to allow you to dart between targets as you need the mouse to. For more generalist FPS gamers, the Saturn is the safest and most traditional mouse pad of the range, and it shines in tactical shooters where initial shot accuracy is key. I found it especially great on ultralight mice like the Final Mouse Starlight 12, where it gave an extra level of stability to mice within the 40 to 50 gram weight bracket. That being said, I do think Zero Killer is being used a little bit liberally here. Whilst the pad is decent, especially the lack of fine lint hair, shout out to any Zero owners, it isn't exactly the Zero Glide, again being that little bit slower than its Artisan counterpart. I also had slightly uneven waves in my rubber base, which was noticeable when I rubbed my hand across it. It didn't really impact me, and I did have a look around, but I didn't see any other examples of it, so I'm going to put that down to a poor QC copy. The Artisan Zero remains, in my opinion, one of the best control pads available on the market, with 3 firmness options to really hone in what your preference is. Conversely, for this performance, you pay a high premium, and the pad often sells out in minutes of becoming available. I think this is where the Saturn competes best with the Zero, and that's value and availability. If you want to road test the Artisan Zero weave, then the Saturn might be a cheap, accessible way to do so, assuming again you live in the US and can get it at the $30 price. Now, so far every pad I've spoken about has been better than the last, but before we wrap, I do need to talk to you about the Jupiter. Now, whilst the Venus, Mercury and Saturn all have Artisan counterparts to place them against, the Jupiter doesn't, and as a consequence I don't really know where Lethal were aiming for this pad to sit. It's billed as their very slow option, but I found the glide to be wildly inconsistent depending on the mouse, skate size, skate type you were using, with no real predictability in how it was going to perform with a given mouse. On the Logitech Superlight with PTFE skates, it was a mud pad. On a Hearty S with ceramic dots, it was more of a hybrid with some glide. I switched over to the Final Mouse Starlight 12 again with stock skates, and it became a high-speed ice rink. The surface also has a glossy sheen to it, almost like a wax polished coating that kind of makes the pad feel incredibly smooth and removes all tactility and texture from the Saturn. This translated to less accuracy and comfort for me in games, and whilst it wasn't unplayable, I didn't ever really feel like I was enjoying my time with it. Using the Superlight as a reference mouse, I felt like it didn't quite have the freedom of micro adjustments that I enjoyed in hybrid pads, but I also didn't have the control on flicks either. The best way to describe the Jupiter is probably a slow glide speed pad. For what it's worth, I tried a lot of different surfaces to try to see if I could get something that felt like it, and the closest comparable was a $15 Lannispala desk mat from IKEA, and I didn't really enjoy gaming on that pad either. My copy of the Jupiter also appeared to have more QC issues than any other pad in the range. I mentioned the logo peeling at the start of the video, but a bigger concern were waves of rippling or dimpled surface that appeared down the left third of the mousepad on the surface. I did raise this with Lethal, and they shared the following statement. This is a known issue impacting a handful of Jupiter customers and is a result of working with a new material and tight tolerances whilst edge stitching. We've already taken steps in our production process to prevent this from happening in future batches. However, if a customer is impacted by the issue, we will of course offer them a replacement pad. I could absolutely look past these QC issues, and I think Lethal have been excellent in their customer response in terms of making it right. But the gliding consistency and the coated feel are both red flags for me, and it's a shame because the other pads are just so flawless in the range. There are multiple disclaimers on the Jupiter store page trying to advise customers of these potential variables, which again is commendable. But ultimately, if I bought this pad as an advertised control pad and ended up with a speed pad because of the combination of skates or feet that I was using, I'd be a highly disappointed customer. The Jupiter is one rough patch that needs a bit more iteration and refinement, but on balance, I've been really impressed by the other pads, in particular the Saturn and the Venus. Outside of the Jupiter, at $30, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be happy with the purchase of one of the Planet pads. Overall, I found the Lethal Planet pads to be a pretty compelling entry into a saturated mousepad market that differentiate themselves with attention to detail and high levels of design. I do hope they make the changes we spoke about to the Jupiter, and I look forward to seeing what else Lethal Gaming have on the horizon for us in the future.